Welcome to With You Podcast.
where we explore relationships and life transitions.
I'm David,
And I'm Tara.
and you're back listening to us.
Yeah.
We are getting close to the end of this season,
Yeah.
and it's this is a doozy.
Right. We've dealt with some fun things and some hard things this season,
Yeah,
and we're wanting to go deeper kind of into the idea of pain.
yeah,
Pain is something that is inevitable in life, and we both really deal with it a lot in our professions. And it's a question that everybody asks about.
yeah. Of why is there pain? How do we respond to it? What happens? All of that, and we're not going to answer all of that, but we're going to get into it. And specifically, I use this book in classes on integration of marriage and family therapy and Christianity. And so we thought we would talk about C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain.
Right. If you think about pain, the problem of pain is a great book
It's a great book.
that digs deep into, that question. And C.S. Lewis wrote a lot of really interesting things about deep questions. And
Yeah.
so we were interested in talking about that book, but we don't have C.S. Lewis here. And he,
No,
if
he died a while ago.
yeah, he's very well known. His writings are very popular at Wheaton College. But if you aren't sure who we're talking about, most people know about him as the writer of the Chronicles of Narnia.
That's right. Aslan and the kids during World War II
Yeah,
in the wardrobe. Dude, I didn't say that right though, British wise.
the wardrobe.
Wardrobe. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all right.
So he wrote fiction. Science fiction kind
Yeah.
of ish.
And then also dealt with a lot of really big questions
Yeah.
and just the idea of what Christianity is and what are some of the big questions that it deals with.
Yeah. He was a Don at Oxford, in literature, and then he and J.R.R. Tolkien got together and met at pubs. They were called the Inklings. They helped each other write, but Tolkien helped Lewis come to Christ. He was a atheist, and as they wrote together, as they asked these big questions, uh, they realized there's hope, and the hope comes in relationship with Jesus. And so he then went on to both write fantasy, but then also write about different theological issues. So he wrote A Grief Observed, dealing with the death of his wife. He wrote kind of The Great Divorce. That was his navigation to faith. And then he wrote The Problem of Pain. And he had pain in his life in lots of different ways and wanted to address a theological way of thinking about pain.
Yeah, so we could have just discussed him, but we're lucky enough to have somebody very close in our own neighborhood who is an expert on C.S. Lewis's writings.
Yeah.
And
Specifically on pain.
right, and has spent more than 50 years reading and studying and writing about C.S. Lewis. So Dr. Jerry Root,
Yep.
who also is at Wheaton College, I will read his official bio
Oh, good.
and tell you some other things that we know about him just personally.
Yeah.
So Dr. Jerry Root is going to be with us for an interview shortly. And just some things to know about him. He's a professor emeritus at Wheaton College, as well as a visiting professor at Biola University, Talbot Graduate School of Theology, and Moody Bible Institute, teaching C.S. Lewis courses at all three schools for over 41 years. And I think it's longer than that now. That
Yeah,
might be
that's
an
an old
old
bio.
bio,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe over 50 years. Dr. Root has lectured on C.S. Lewis topics at 78 universities in 18 countries. He's always
remarkable.
traveling. He's the author of numerous C.S. Lewis focused books, articles, and publications. He's married to Claudia Root,
Yep.
and together they have 4 married children and 15 grandchildren.
He's prolific in all the ways.
Yes.
And
So, yeah, we're so lucky that he's right nearby and agreed to join us and talk about this
yeah,
topic.
and it helps that he's a friend.
It
That
does.
we know him and do life together, and so we wrangled him in to come and speak
Yeah.
with us. And it's not an all-encompassing coverage of pain.
Well, I wanted to add a few more things
Oh,
about
about
Jerry
Jerry.
because that's his official bio.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
the scholarly reasons why he's a good expert on this topic. But
That's
other
right.
things that I think are important to know about Jerry because he's a really well-rounded guy.
Yeah.
So I love that he grew up in Southern California and really appreciates the palm. It's snowing in our area today.
We got 4 inches of
invited him
snow.
to our home for this discussion. And I was trying to be positive about the snow, and he said, "No, the palm trees are really
Yeah.
better."
He was having none of it.
He appreciates the sunshine and the palm trees. In college, he was a football player and wrestler.
Yeah.
And actually, I knew he was a football player. I don't think I knew that he wrestled, but to me, it explains a lot about his personal space.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
Jerry likes to get really close to you when
Yeah.
you're talking,
Not just
and
me,
to
people.
anyone. He
Yeah.
just kind of he gets in, he
Yeah.
listens, he focuses, and I think wrestlers have a different idea of personal space.
Yeah.
So it explains a lot about
Yeah,
Jerry.
he gives hugs where he picks you up off the ground.
Yeah.
Now not so much anymore, but back in the day, it
He
was a
kind of
full-bodied
rivals
experience.
you in the hugging department because
Yeah.
you're known for the hugging
Yeah.
on campus. And Jerry, like when the two of you get together, we all worry a little bit.
Yeah,
Like,
Tara had to use a pry bar to get us apart so that we could actually
that
have the
sounds a little
conversation.
strange. But anyway, so Jerry also continued to play football until he was 44 years old or
Yeah.
something, which is impressive that
Mhm.
he's not doesn't have more personal injury.
Yep.
He also, another thing I love about him is he really loves adrenaline inducing activities like
You and him.
skydiving, swimming with sharks, spelunking. He says he loves turbulence on an airplane. Like
Yeah.
he loves adventure.
In the ride over to the
Yeah.
home, he was like, I have some friends that do aerobatic aeronautical things. And so he's like, have you ever heard of like, I don't even remember what it was called, but it's basically where you stall out the plane.
Yeah.
You go up, it stalls out, it starts falling back down to ground and has to start up again. And he just giggled with glee.
That might push my boundaries a little.
Yeah, so he seeks all of life.
Yes, and we love that, like his just adventurous spirit, but we also just know him as a deeply relational soul
Mhm.
who's really curious about people and the world. And so we think this discussion is going to be really great. We don't know where it's going to go,
Yeah,
but
it's always an adventure.
we're going to talk about pain, and we understand that so we're dealing with like the biggest really essential human question
Yeah.
of why.
Why?
Why is there pain? Why does God allow pain? Why is there suffering in the world? Which is just a, the question itself is painful.
Yeah.
So we're going to deal with that, but knowing it's pretty much an unanswerable question.
Yeah. And when you have an answer, there's like 4 or 5 layers deeper. And
Right.
Jerry acknowledges this and that here's the best approximation of where we are, and we can move deeper. And then he moves us into the more hows.
Yeah. Yeah. So the why we can struggle with, and it might be a
Mhm.
lifelong struggle with the why. But we do talk about, so if we can't answer why, what is our response to it? We can only control our response and how we cope
Mhm.
with the hard things in
Yeah.
life. So when we talk about pain, we're talking about pain that happens to us,
Yeah.
the painful things we all experience and struggle with.
We're talking about the pain that we do to each other or
Right.
that I do to others.
Right. So the pain that we might inflict, whether it's intentional or unintentionally on others, and if we're humans, that happens.
Yep. And then it's the pain we see on the news and in our community and the things that happen to people around us that
Yeah.
isn't directly connected to us, but we feel deeply.
Yeah, which honestly I feel is some of my worst pain that I feel is watching others suffer.
Yeah.
So I think that's a real thing too, is knowing how we cope with that,
Yeah.
the suffering of others.
And Jerry talks about and will as we unpack Lewis as well of there's a heart issue, there's the cognitive thought issue, and then there's the action, the
Yeah.
agency issue. And we need to be dealing with all three. And I think the why tends to be in the head. We tend to want to make meaning, make sense of
Yeah.
it. The heart is what you were talking about.
How do I cope with how I feel about it?
Yeah, the pain and the reflection of what that is.
Yeah. And then what do I do with it?
Yeah.
Do it with it and for it and to alleviate it.
So my guess is we're going to touch those bases, and I don't know in what order or how much. That's always the adventure. Like we have ideas that we're going to talk with Jerry
Yeah,
about.
and we will in just under an hour probably touch on all of those ideas. And this is probably one you'll have to listen to again because Jerry's ideas are deep, and we will ask for some resources. So if you're interested in these ideas, look at the show notes. We will list some things for further reading
Yep.
that might help you go deeper with
Yeah.
this.
And hopefully it'll be academic. It'll be those three things, right? Head issues of like the deep academic questions, heart issues in terms of what goes on for us emotionally, and maybe that's more creative resources,
Yeah.
and then the action of what to do. So
Yeah.
we'll see. We don't know where we're going, but whenever we enter into pain, we want to lean in and breathe
Yeah.
and
So take a
see
deep breath
where it takes
and
us.
we will welcome Dr. Jerry Root.
So 3, 2, 1. All right, we're happy that you're here, Jerry.
Thank you. I'm
Welcome.
glad to be here.
Thank
I'm
you for
grateful.
coming.
And it's a beautifully blustery day, so it's perfect to talk about pain.
I know, but in Winnie the Pooh, a blustery day was a kite flying day.
No, it's not. It's not.
Not-
No.
Not in snow. I've never tried that.
I was shocked this morning. I didn't know it was snowing. I was planning to do some yard
It
work.
feels cozy though. Doesn't it make you sort of long for just a nice pub day with,
It makes me long for Santa Barbara.
Oh, yeah. See, Jerry,
Oh.
my guy.
See, I was thinking we're going to have some pints and some our pipes.
You don't need snow for that.
Oh, you don't? Oh, I thought you
think he appreciates California and the palm trees. Better than the
fair.
snow.
That's fair.
Yeah.
There was a time
But-
in my life I didn't like palm trees.
Yeah.
Growing up in Southern California, I always thought they didn't give you foliage, they didn't give you shade,
Yeah.
and I thought they're just, they look like bottle brushes
Yeah.
and stuff.
Yeah.
And then a friend of mine said, no, they're nature's fireworks.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
That just gave me a different perspective on it. And I go, okay, I like these palm trees.
Yeah.
It's all perspective, and that's a really good
Yeah.
lead in to what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes,
Well done.
That's why she's here. She keeps us on track.
I know, because we could talk about sunshine and palm trees all day. I'd be happy to do that.
That was good.
But we're here to talk about pain. We've focused in this season on our podcast on sort of the juxtaposition of play and pain, but the importance of pain and how it's a given in the human experience. And so we were excited that somebody like you, who's kind of done a lot of writing and thinking about pain, and Lewis's writing on pain, is right in our neighborhood. So
I'm
we,
grateful.
yeah,
Well, we're grateful.
yeah.
And we wanted to start out with, how did you get hooked up with Lewis?
Uh-huh.
Right?
Yeah, I became a Christian when I was in my first year of college, and I was so moved by the gospel that I started sharing Christ with my football buddies and my fraternity buddies, and they were all asking questions that I had never once asked in my life, like, if God's good and all powerful, why does evil exist in the universe? I'm embarrassed to say it never even crossed my mind before I was a Christian. But obviously, these guys were asking it, and it was an important question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would start digging for answers because I thought if that's the only barrier keeping you from faith, I won't leave a stone unturned. And a name kept cropping up in the literature.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis. I was interested. I liked the quotes I read, but I never really read it. I visited my sister one spring break when I was in college, and she was teaching fifth grade and reading to them The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And over dinner, she told me the plot of that book. And I go, come on, there's books like this? And I had no idea. I mean, I think I read 6 books before I went to college, not counting comic books. So she told me about it. I went out and bought a set of the Narnian books, and I read them, and I was intrigued. I bought Surprised by Joy, his story of how he moved from atheism to Christianity. And the deep longings that haunted him, that was the book. That was the issue that grabbed me, because I knew those longings, but he gave me a vocabulary for my own soul. So I started reading him voraciously. And when I graduate from college, a man said to me wisely, you don't get an education in college, you lay a foundation for one. And the commencement, what we call graduation exercises, commencement means you will now commence your education by building on that foundation. Pick an author who will take you places and make him your life steady. I think he could have said, pick an artist, pick a composer, pick a period of history, something that will keep you stretching and growing.
Yep.
I picked Lewis. I could have done worse.
Yeah.
He opens more than wardrobe doors. I started reading the books he was referring to. He was my liberal arts education. I go to graduate school and I have to write a thesis. And I was a PE major in college. I was used to writing 5 pages in crayon. I got to write a thesis, and
Yeah.
I asked them. There's no way I was going to write it on the use of the optative mood in the Greek text of Philemon. That wasn't going to. And I said, "Do you think I could write? I could write on C.S. Lewis?" I said, "Yeah." So then I put pen to paper, and then from then it started. Publishing articles and chapters and books and lecturing on him and all that. Even when I was a pastor, before I took an academic post, I was teaching. I was a pastor for 23 years, but I taught adjunct for 16 of those years, and then started teaching full time for 25 years. I taught full time, but while I was an adjunct teacher, I would go to theology conferences and read papers. Just because I thought it would stretch me as a human being.
Yeah.
I never realized it would give me a leg up when I went to take an academic post, because I'd already done all these academic papers and stuff. I was just trying to grow. And Lewis was my guide.
I got distracted by the comic book part. Do you know there's a graphic novel now out about Lewis and Tolkien's relationship?
I just bought it in Oxford last week.
Did you?
Last
Okay.
week.
So I was like, it sounds fascinating. Have you been able to
Well,
peruse it yet?
I perused through it before I bought it, and
Yeah.
I saw that it was accurate.
Okay.
At least the parts I saw.
Yeah.
And so I bought it for Claudia to give to me at Christmas.
Oh, that's perfect.
That's brilliant.
That's 50 years of marriage, right?
Well, I'll tell you,
giving.
that's the only way Claudia and I do it, because one year my daughter dropped a crayon down the laundry chute. Went down, got it, dropped it down again, went down, dropped it down again. The last time she didn't get it. So then when my white shirts got washed, they came out camo.
Yeah.
And it was just before
Had that
Thanksgiving.
happen.
All the relatives called at Thanksgiving, and Claudia told them that story. That Christmas, I got 8 white shirts. It was the worst Christmas of my life. So now I said, I'm not getting anything that people give me. You know how it is. They
Yeah.
always give you stuff you didn't want.
Yeah.
So I always give Claudia what I want.
That, and she wraps it up and
No, I wrap
oh,
it up.
you wrap it up. I think we have a new
Signed, sealed,
tradition.
delivered.
Yeah.
I wrap all the presents. I save all the money for the presents. I wrap all the presents. She puts the bows on them.
There you go.
Oh, there.
You got a good balance.
We have a
Yeah.
great balance.
From pain comes solutions.
Yeah.
That was painful to get 8 shirts.
It was really bad. It was really a bad Christmas.
But it started a new tradition, so that's nice.
Yeah, it did.
That's good.
Anyway, there you go.
There you go. Well, that's helpful to think about how you got here and
Yeah.
how C.S. Lewis is giving you plenty to keep working on so many
Yeah.
years later.
We never get to
Um,
the bottom of it.
No.
And
No.
you don't get to the, I don't think any true thing, you can have a sure word about something. You know a truth, but that truth could still be plumbed deeper. It could be applied wider, even to questions you haven't begun to ask. So though you can have a sure word, you don't get a last word about anything. So you hold what you know with an open hand of humility. There's always more. And
Yeah.
that's not a threat, because it's the doorway to wonder and awe and these sorts of
Mm.
things.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool.
Well, and you can't ever get to the bottom of the question that he talks about in the problem of evil, and that you've talked about with the problem of pain, because that's the essential human question, right?
Mm.
Like, why do we suffer? Why is there pain in the world? I think your friends were asking you that, the football guys, and that's the thing a lot of people struggle with.
But even asking the question, why do we suffer?
Mm-hmm.
It makes an assumption. And the assumption is there must be an answer to this someplace.
Right.
Yeah.
And blind
Right.
people don't ask what's out there of color or what's out there
Yeah.
as far as a vista. Because if we came from a world of blindness, so there might have been an objective world beyond our purview.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we would be even asking the question, because it wasn't part of human experience if that was the case. As soon as we ask, why do we suffer? Like 9/11, when it occurred, Todd Beamer, the guy who was on
Mhm.
Flight 93, said, let's roll.
Yeah.
He used to be a kid in my youth group. He used to come to my house for Bible study.
He was a classmate of ours.
Well, he was getting up
Yeah.
to do work. How come you weren't in my college?
Yeah, we we have to wait. We're late bloomers.
Yeah,
We-
we're taking the class right now.
So anyway, I remember he was getting up to do work. He went on an airplane flight. He was going to fly back
Yeah.
the next day after he did this work. And I thought, well, one, how could people be safe?
Yeah.
Well, why would I assume that safety was out there if there was no safety?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Doesn't that make an assumption?
Mhm.
And if I say, afterwards, I said, what is this going to come to mean? And I still think we're trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
But it means that you believe that there's meaning that can be found. If there is no meaning to be found, we wouldn't even be asking the question.
Right.
And Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, who suffered in the concentration camps and so on, he begins with that assumption. And he makes a statement: if there's a meaning in life, there must be a meaning in suffering. And it's worth talking about because we're people involved in this process,
Yeah.
people who can hurt and experience pain. So we think of two things at least. How do we get our minds around it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, how do we get our hearts around it?
Yeah.
They're a little bit different activities. And lastly, then we have to say, how do we get our will around it? Because there's choices we can make in the midst of it.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about understanding, to understand, it's an infinitive, right? That comes from a verb. All verbs require tense. So you have past tense, present tense, future tense, and so on. And I think our understanding of these things also takes on different times, where at one moment we can understand it one way, at another moment we can understand it in a more robust way, in another moment we encounter somebody else who's processing and we benefit from what they've learned in the process too. So I think all of that is engaged. I can give you examples of it too, but
Yeah, well, and the thing that that we ask the question means there needs to be something connected to it. Of if we're asking about pain, then there has to be joy. If we're making assumptions, like Rabbi Kirshner in his book in 1983 of why do bad things happen to good people? I always joke and say that's the wrong title.
Yeah.
If we think about who we are as people, who we are connected to God, is why does anything good happen at all? Rather than making the assumption we're good and the situations are bad.
There needs to be a nuancing of it too, though, I think, David, because there are some people who say if we didn't experience bad, we could never know good. And that's another falsehood. God is good, and he was good before there was any bad.
Yeah.
Christians believe that good is primary. Evil is a perversion of the good.
Yeah.
And evil wouldn't exist without good. You can't think of a bad banana without thinking of a good banana that went bad.
Yeah.
And evil, in Lewis's understanding, compares to good like bread mold compares to bread. You have to have the good before the other can be spoiled. But even that doesn't limit us, because humans can do great things with bread mold. We make penicillin from it. Will we not at least allow God that level of creativity that he could bring good out of bad?
Yeah.
And then you begin to think about some of these things, and you see how it works. How if we think about it any length of time, how we can come up with understanding of that. And I don't want to keep going on because you might have questions, but there are a couple things here I'd love to.
Yeah.
We'd love to just expound and tell stories.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll give you two events. One, years ago, when I was a college pastor, I had this young man whose great aunt was dying of cancer, and they lived 3,000 miles from their grandparents. This great aunt and uncle had no kids, and they were like surrogate grandparents. And the grandmother was ready to die, and she wanted to know if she could have hope after death. And he asked if I would go talk with her. And I said, sure. We set up the appointment. I show up at the house, 10 o'clock on a Friday morning. The great uncle answers the door, and he starts screaming at me. What kind of a God do you serve? Why would he allow my wife to suffer? Why doesn't he allow some dictator to suffer? He's screaming at me. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't need to be here. I promised David I would be there.
Yeah.
And so he screams at me all through the formal living room. We go into the den. There's the great aunt sitting down. I knew she had been bedridden. I knew it was a tremendous effort. She had showered and gotten up. She had a wig on to cover the hair loss from the cancer treatment. She had a dress that fit her like a tent because of all the weight loss from the cancer treatment. She's sitting in the chair, and he continues to scream at me for 10 or 15 minutes. Finally, he stomps out of the room. The great aunt looks at me and says, I'm dying of cancer. Can you tell me how I can go to heaven? I get on my knees next to her. I take her hands in mine. I share the gospel. And with tears in both of our eyes, she trusted Christ. I leave. She dies. Family asks me to do the funeral. As soon as the funeral's over, the great uncle comes walking up to me. I'm going,
Here we go.
He grabs my hand in both of his, and with tears in his eyes, He says, thank you for coming by that day.
Mm.
Thank you for coming by that day. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Because naturally he was mad. He was losing his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Naturally, she was concerned about heaven. She's losing her life.
Mm.
And naturally, when he saw the comfort that her new faith brought her, he was grateful that she didn't suffer in that area.
Mm.
And I just thought, it may mean something to us here, but it may mean something to us later. And if a person gets stuck in the present tense of the issue of suffering
Yeah.
and doesn't move beyond it,
Mm.
then they end up digging a hole for themselves.
Yeah.
But if they're willing to just sit with it for a time and
Yeah.
wrestle with the issues of it, then maybe they can move beyond it and they could see some good come from it. Okay, so now the second point is this. I want you for a moment to think of the worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. You don't have to share it, but just get it in your mind.
Yeah.
Now think of the second worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. Got it? Now think of the third worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. Got it?
Mm-hmm.
Now think of the fourth worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. Got it?
Mm-hmm.
Now think of the fifth worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. Got it?
Yes.
Now think of the sixth worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. You got it?
Yeah.
You're laughing. Now think of the seventh worst thing that ever happened to you in your life.
Now it's getting harder.
Now think of the eighth worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. Now think of the ninth worst thing that ever happened to you in your life.
I think I'm running out of.
Now think, everybody
thoughts.
runs out. I've never had anybody get to more than 10, even asking it in underground schools in Ceausescu, the Stalinist dictators of Romania.
Yeah.
And everybody in the room had suffered for their faith. Nobody got to more than 10. I asked it in Sudan to southern Sudanese tribal Christians, all of whom had seen relatives hacked to death by the Janjaweed. Nobody got to more than 10. But let's say you get to 10, 20, 30.
Yeah.
By contrast, think of all the good things that ever happened to you in your life.
Mm.
The night you went to bed with a roof over your head, you had 3 square meals in a day, that you saw beauty, that you laughed over something, that you read a book that had substance. We could go on and on. I'm feeding the second list, obviously.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I'm trying to point out the fact that the bad we've experienced, painful as it is, are errant brushstrokes across a massive canvas of good.
Mm.
And consequently, if we see it in that perspective, that helps. But now, go back to the bad you've experienced.
Yeah.
Did you ever, given time, see any good come from any of those bad things you experienced? Maybe you grew in wisdom. Maybe there was a resolution. Maybe you gained more empathy for other people who have suffered. So there was some good that came from it. If good came from some of the bad given time, you have good reason to believe that good could come from all of it given eternity. But you have no good reason whatsoever to say no bad could ever come from, or no good could ever come from this, because your own experience counts against that judgment.
So how do you do that in the moment, right? Because with time we can look back and it gives us that perspective. Because I can think, so for me it was the death of a sibling.
Yeah.
And in the moment it was hard to see anything else but that moment. And you kind of talked about that in the first story. How do we live in that moment of pain with the knowledge of over time we might see something come from it, but it's flooding in that moment.
It's tough. And I agree with you. And I also lost a sibling, and I know what those things are about. But you say live is a verb. So you're in the present tense.
Yeah.
The present tense doesn't have to stay present tense forever. Some people it does, because they won't let go of that moment.
Yeah.
Instead of entering into the present tense as a verb that's moving towards a future tense. And so we have to sort of apply tools that'll help us get by.
Yeah.
I don't think we deny our pain.
Yeah.
I don't think we suppress it. Even the scriptures say, if somebody hurts you, be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down your anger. Don't deny your humanity. You're hurting.
Yeah.
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 But don't dig a hole there, because it says, don't let the sun go down in your anger, lest you become bitter and give the devil an opportunity. There's a guy, Vance Havner, is a Southern preacher. He says, if a bad man does a bad thing to you, forgive him, lest there become 2 bad men. And we could begin, we could become bitter to the degree that we don't realize in our own bitterness we're doing the things to others that we had loathed done to us. And so consequently, how do you engage in the process?
Yeah.
Well, you don't deny the anger.
Yeah.
Be angry, But do not sin. Don't let the sun go down in your anger. Don't extend the present tense into future tense.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you do that? Well, you have to grieve.
Yep.
And you have to begin the process of forgiving. And the process of forgiving is a difficult thing. Jesus says, pray for your enemies. Well, I've had a couple bad experiences, and I thought, okay, I'm going to pray for them. And I prayed the imprecatory psalms over them. How blessed those who bash Babylonia. I pray, Lord, all my enemies' children will be orphans. I don't think God wants us bashing anybody's heads against the rocks.
No.
But aren't there times in your faith where you feel like you want to shake somebody?
Yeah.
Is your faith in irrelevancy in that moment, or has God given you a template to take this stuff and cry out to Him with Him because He's the utterly safe relationship? And you can engage with these things in Him so you could press out the pus of that moment and the wound could begin to heal. Eventually, if you do this, the prayers will become softer.
Yeah.
Lord, don't let them ever do something like this to somebody else. And eventually they become magnanimous. Lord, I pray that you would bring good to their life so whatever pain they're dealing with that's causing problems for others because they haven't worked it out could eventually be resolved in them so that they could do better. So I think that there's where the forgiveness and the grieving come in sync. And you have it, a great example of it in the scriptures, I think, is with Joseph.
Yeah.
He's got these terrible brothers who do terrible things to him. But think about the brothers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
How would you feel if you were the unloved child of your father? They've got issues too.
Right.
There's sadness there.
Right.
And the rivalry and all that stuff. But here's Joseph. Jacob favors him. That's not Joseph's fault. But he's the firstborn son of his preferred wife. And you've got all this favoritism. You go, why does it go on?
Yeah.
You know, Jacob should know better. He was the unloved son of his father Isaac, who preferred Esau over him. And then you got some ambiguity.
Those family patterns.
Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and so on. So anyway, Joseph sold into slavery.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, Judah, he's really a good guy. He says, yeah, why should we kill him? We can make some money on it. So they sell him into slavery. He goes through a horrible situation. If I was God, and aren't you glad I'm not?
Yes.
I would not have said the best way to prepare a guy to be the prime minister of Egypt is to make him a slave for so many years, put him in prison, and make him in charge of the prison.
Yeah.
Because the prison guard puts him in charge.
Yeah.
So he has to bring peers who are incorrigible into order and bring chaos out of the prison. It's unbelievable the things that were done. I would have sent him to Harvard for an MBA or something like that.
Yeah.
But something's going on in Joseph.
Yeah.
And how does he get better? When he's finally elevated to prime minister of Egypt, Pharaoh gives him the priest's daughter as a wife. He has 2 children by her. Manasseh, which means forget. And I think it meant he forgave to the forget place. He forgave to the place where it didn't hold him anymore. Because we know he remembers when the brothers come to buy grain, he gives them the first thing he does, he says to the brothers, do you have any more brothers? If 10 brothers showed up, that's the last question I'd ask him. I figured that was all of them, right?
He wanted to know what they did to Benjamin.
What happened? Yeah. So anyway, so he says, do you have any other brothers? I need to find out where he is to rescue him. But then he gives them a meal and seats them in chronological order of their birth. He remembers details. He asks questions about Jacob and so on. So he remembers, but why did he name him forget? Manasseh? Because he had processed forgiveness to the place where it didn't hold him anymore. Second son, Ephraim, means be fruitful. So he realized that even through the pain, there was fruitfulness to come if he would just endure. And now that endurance issue opens up a whole new thread of discussion about this thing that relates to the cultivation of virtue and these sorts of things.
So it's interesting. The 3 stories that you shared, there's the experience of pain that we're having and being able to be beyond the moment, be present with it, but also realize there's a formation that could happen from here. There's good that could happen from here. But there's also, I think about that great uncle yelling at you. There's when people in your perspective was, he was in pain. His wife was dying.
I didn't come immediately to that.
No, but I think it's a lesson we learn through that. And like you talked about us lamenting with God, of the model that God can tolerate our anger, can tolerate our grief, that pain isn't something to be afraid of, but to lean into. both. I think because being the profession I am, Tara, we see purposeful pain and we see pain that's hard to make sense of.
Yeah.
And leaning into it is not a normal thing. Just like primary people, police and fire, they run to the crisis. And I think you and Tara do that too. You're adrenaline freaks. You run into things that most people run away from. We need those skills around
Yeah.
pain, running into it with people
Yeah.
rather than from it. And our bodies sometimes tell us, get out.
Well, it may not be a running to it, it may be a slow movement towards it. But I
Yeah.
don't think that you're going to solve the problem if you run away from it.
No.
You've got to somehow endure this at some level.
Yeah. And you said a couple of times something about staying in the present. It's present tense. It's, we sit with it. I think what is extra hard is when there's chronic pain or chronic suffering.
A
that
person who's caught up in sex trafficking, who's every day got the same
every day,
smell,
anything
weird
that's like
feeling.
every day you wake up and you're in the same situation and your body hurts or you're stuck somewhere and I think that's what's hard for us to make sense of when we're in it. And it's really hard to make sense of when we watch other people go through it. Because it feels like every day that present tense is still there. So I think as humans, always wanting to look forward and is there an ending to this? Is there a meaning for it? Because that can help me endure it.
As I pray about that each day, the sex trafficking and the human trafficking and so on, I think I try to enter into the angst of that.
Yeah.
And you don't see any solution unless we as Christians or we as just citizens fight against it till we could eventually eliminate it. Like in any war, you fight against some aggressive, abusive, totalitarian state or something like that. But I do think there's still something that a person can choose, even if they're in the midst of it. And you think about a person who's maybe born with severe disabilities. They've got a good mind,
Yeah.
but they've got these disabilities.
Yeah.
You think of that Vic Boyacek, you know of him? He's the guy that was born without arms and legs.
Oh, yeah.
And he wrote
Yeah.
the book Life Without Limits.
Mm-hmm.
Because he felt he didn't have limits. He's making some choices in the midst of this. And those choices gave him the opportunity to see possibility in the midst of why did God make him this way? And this gets down to some fundamental things. Here's the present, but there's a lot beyond it. There's a past. Why am I vulnerable in the present? Because maybe of decisions I made back here that didn't teach me the art of how to go through a difficulty in the present. And there's the future. How can I get out of that?
Yeah.
That means then there's things that transcend the present moment. And we would say there's also a vertical transcendence. There's God at work in that situation. So Dante, I love Dante.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote the Vita Nuova
Yeah.
about first love when he first met Beatrice. Then he writes a Divine Comedy. What does first love really mean? And he sees that Beatrice is the one who awakened him to his ultimate first love, his love for God. Between that, he wrote two other books, The Convivo and the De Monarchia. And in the De Monarchia, he said, function precedes essence. Function precedes essence. That God had a purpose before he gave us the essence to fulfill that purpose. So he makes light on day one. There's a function. He doesn't make the luminaries, sun, moon, and stars till day 4. He gives the essences after he had the purpose in mind.
Mm-hmm.
If he gives me the essence of the liabilities of my own temperament and personality, the liabilities of my background and so on, he also, in those liabilities, has purposes for me. And those then can become, at some level, assets. So how do I learn about this? So here I am in a moment of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
There's a guy named Jerry Sitzer. He's a historical theologian. He's a guy that wrote A Grace Disguised after his wife Linda died and so on. We knew Jerry well. Claudia went to college with them at Hope College, and we were in youth ministry together, and we used to meet, regularly for lunch and stuff. But anyway, Jerry, in one of his books, writes this: we're most like God in the world when we're most unlike him in relationship with him. I'm going to say it again.
Mm-hmm.
We're most like God in the world when we're most unlike him in relationship with him. Mm-hmm. God alone is independent. So I have to come to him unlike him in utter dependence upon him, that I might then, receiving from him characteristics like his, I can go into the world independent of the world so I could be a giver rather than a user and a taker.
Yeah.
And this is really important.
Something really supernatural about that.
There is.
Yeah.
But that means I'm not stuck in the moment. It gives me a way to at least begin to get my mind around it, and hopefully eventually get my character around it, and so on. That God has a purpose for me in this, even though it's hard to see in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a verb. Every verb has tense. Every experience has tense. It's either going to Charles Williams says, heaven is a rose, hell is a funnel. And I can bring myself to a decision where I can, through this tough experience, begin to blossom into a rose, or I could dig deeper and deeper and go down into the funnel. And there's some volitional choice in the midst of that.
Yeah. So do you have times where you felt like you've had that choice point where you're struggling with something, you're feeling really the depths of pain, where how volitional is that? Like, how do you get to that place?
Well, one thing that happens is usually, because we don't know very much, we're all pea brains, you know. Usually when we come to the crisis, we try to manage it ourselves, and we find we've dug a deeper hole for ourselves.
Yeah.
And I remember once hearing the wisdom of a person who said that we can always find God at the end of our rope. You know, so how bad do we have to make it?
Yeah.
How much exacerbation do we have to bring to the situation? And I think in my life, the places where I finally said, you know what, I'm not doing well here. And we end up turning to God. The tendency is to want to run from God.
Yeah.
But instead, we need to turn our backs to the trouble and run to him. And this Jerry Sitzer, even when he lost his wife and his daughter and his mother, and their whole family was injured and beat up by this accident, he said he just constantly lived in this nightmare and daymare where he was always running towards the setting sun, trying to keep from being consumed by the darkness. And his sister, who had her own losses through all of this, she said, Jerry, you're doing it all wrong. You need to turn and face the dark and run to the dawn. And that's such wisdom. And I think that in a fallen world, we don't get free of the darkness in this world, but we have the hope of the light that's coming, the morning that's coming, that's going to break upon us. And we get down payments on it throughout our life if we respond well to these situations. And there's this interesting passage in C.S. Lewis. It's a throwaway line in one of his literary critical works called The Allegory of Love. Page 60.
It's that
Quotable Lewis.
It's there. It's there. He said, innocence is not goodness. He's not saying innocence is not good. It's good in that it's unspoiled.
Yeah.
But it's not goodness. It's not proven character. He says even divine nature, even in its prime, cannot make a virtue a gift. So if I say I'm most like God in the world when I'm most unlike him in relationship with him, if I'm having troubles forgiving, I need to go to him with all my unforgiveness, receive from him his grace so that I can be more of a forgiver.
Yeah.
And so the difficulty should drive me to him and not away from him. So let's say in an area, I have an area of temptation or an area of anger or something like this. I can't seem to get over it. Maybe I enlist my friends to pray for me. And I try to deliberately and consciously address this issue, moving towards it again.
Yeah.
And there comes this moment where, different than my past behavior, I get through it and I don't fall. And then the next moment or next time it comes up, a few weeks later, I get through it and I don't fall. And the next time I get through it and I don't fall. Next time I don't get through it and don't fall. Next time I do fall. So we're learning habit here, right? And so it takes time. But eventually it comes to a place where I am facing this particular issue that used to always devastate me. And I've cultivated the habits by the grace of God to where I get through it and I hardly even have to think about it anymore. At that moment, I'm better than Adam and Eve were before the fall because they had innocence and I'm developing Christ-likeness in those crises. I shouldn't get full of myself or cocky because God will pull back the screen and let me see the thousands of other things I have yet to work on. But you begin to think, well, maybe there was a reason why God allowed the fall. He wants to build in these people character that looks like Jesus, and they're not going to get there without some degree of suffering and
Yeah.
pain.
Well, in the relational literature, we see change comes from frustration, optimal frustration, the sense of some kind of challenge
The moment of
that
disequilibrium.
yeah, we can find a new balance and new behaviors,
Yeah.
new virtues that develop. The frustrating thing for me is it takes time. I think society, culturally, we're in an instantaneous
On a quick fix.
want a quick fix. We see that in medication for managing pain. We see all the things to try to not turn our backs to it to focus on the light, but to just extinguish it altogether.
And there's an irony in that, isn't there? Because I want the pain to stop, so I go to the quick fix,
Yeah.
which I call it an anesthetizing behavior.
Yeah.
It deadens the pain temporarily, but it keeps me stuck in the vortex of the circumstances I haven't been willing to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that kind of goes to Lewis's megaphone, pain as
Yeah,
God's
megaphone.
megaphone. You had a quote
Yeah.
here.
Well, yeah. And I know you've done the quotable Lewis. You've memorized all of it.
Right, so
But I liked
I'll
that
say to
quote. I
somebody-
wrote it
I'll
down.
say to somebody, where did you get that from your book?
Oh yeah, it's hard to keep all those things. Well, so I wrote it down. So, because I think it's a really great way to talk about how God uses pain, even though I think that can hurt people too when people try to make meaning of it and say that God intended it for good or for some reason. But tell me what you think of this. We can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks
Shouts.
to us in our conscience, but shouts
To us
in
in
our
our
pain. And it's the megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
He can shout to us in pleasure too. There are times when you've maybe been on a walk and you saw a sunrise or a sunset and you had to
You have to
stop
stop.
and just take it in and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So I think both could happen, but usually the pain gets our attention more readily.
Well, and like you said, with the number of things, those painful things tend to outweigh the good things in our minds and our memories.
Yeah.
We remember the hurtful things that somebody said to us more than all the nice things they said.
Well, I'm not there, but I can conceive that it would be possible that we've learned enough in life that when the painful thing comes, we first go to the realization good will come from this.
Mm,
I think it's possible.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that I've achieved that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, another quote that I thought, this is not from his Problem of Pain, it's from the Reflections on the Psalms. But I think we've tried to grow in this area too. The quote from Lewis says, where we find a difficulty, we may always expect that discovery awaits us.
Yeah, in the
And
weight of,
I like that.
in the weight of glory, and so many preach at Oxford University says something very similar. If our religion is objective, then we must never avert our eyes from those elements in it which seem troubling or puzzling. For it's precisely in the troubling and puzzling where we learn what we do not yet know and
Yeah.
need to know. And that keeps us mindful of the fact that
Yeah.
we are pea brains. We do not know very much when you
Yeah.
think of all that's
Yeah.
out there. So that means there's a way that we could grow and we can lean into these things again, maybe even seek advice from others
Yeah.
who maybe have gone a little further than us and so on. I
Yeah.
don't want to seek advice from the bitter and peevish person who clearly has dug a hole and buried themselves.
Right. You don't want to be like that. But I like the word discovery too, because I think it's easier to get in that mindset of what is there to discover rather than going all the way to what is good about this.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you can't feel that yet.
Yeah.
But what is there to discover about God, about myself, about the world? That can be just a slight twist of how we stay in the present moment and keep a discovery sort of mindset.
It's a hopeful thought, Tara, but it's also one that I think can be cultivated
Mhm.
by the remembering that in the moment throughout my life, every moment that's ever come, there was a moment that came after.
Mhm.
And I think I have to be mindful of that. We're embodied souls and we're also eternal beings. We weren't made to live in the moment. We were
Right.
made to live through moments. So I think that's important too.
Yeah. So that's probably what keeps us so future mindset, because we don't feel like we
Yeah.
belong here.
So I want to make the most of this moment because I know there's a moment to come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You changed all those diapers of all your kids because you knew there would come a time when you wouldn't need to do that. And your kids
When
would,
they would change ours.
yeah, that's coming. Yeah,
We're looking,
Sorry, kids.
yeah, looking forward to that.
yeah. Just gonna say, see,
It's an opportunity to learn vulnerability and lead into that. One of the things I've been playing with, well, there's two thoughts I have. I'll do the song one first. So in my class, we do an integration class, and it's basically how do we deal with suffering from a theological and a marriage and family therapy perspective. And we end each class by singing "It Is Well with My Soul."
oh, yeah, that's good.
And Horatio Spafford,
Yeah.
the one that wrote that,
Yeah.
had tragedy.
Yeah.
His wife and kids were sailing to England,
Yeah.
and there was a shipwreck.
Yeah.
All his kids died, and his wife survived. And he then later on sailed to meet them and meet her. And when he got over the spot, the ship's captain came to him and said, this is the place where your children died. And this was his response. And thinking about that, of it is future oriented. It is, well, it's not okay, but it is well with my soul. I understand that future moment. I understand where I'm going, and I hurt. But that leads into the idea of suffering and love being connected. For me, of it's almost like if you think of it as a coin, because we love, we have the potential for suffering. And this comes out of trying to think through, if God is permanent, right? There's nothing we can do to change. He's sufficient in who he is. Then our sin doesn't go, oh, now I have to become a suffering savior. There's something about suffering. There's something about pain within the Godhead in perfection. And I've been troubled by that, trying to struggle with it. And for me, the best thing I can come up with right now is that he is love. The potential for suffering is always there. The potential for pain because of the love. I'm curious, like, your thoughts around that.
It probably should remain curious because there's some enigmas in there.
Yeah.
Here's the God of the universe who's omnipotent and all powerful. Why does he allow himself to be vulnerable? Pascal said Christians worship a God humiliated.
Yeah.
He was willing to enter into humiliation. And you see the magnitude of his grace extended in that willingness. I mean, here's Jesus on the cross, and you have these religious leaders coming at the foot of the cross saying, if you're the Son of God, come down from the cross and save yourself. We're good at self-justification. We're good at rationalization. We're good at all these saving self. You know, they say in negotiations, you want to get the person to be able to save themselves. You know, come away with some sense of. And Jesus didn't come down from the cross to save himself, because he came to save lost humanity. And that's difficult for me to get my mind around. I'm moved by it intensely, so moved that I wanted to respond to that kind of grace and give my life over to the God who does that sort of thing. But it recognizes also that if I'm going to move in that direction, there may be times when he wants me to walk in that light. And to do this. So you've got, Lewis picks up on it quite a bit. You know, you've got Jadis, Queen of Charn, in The Magician's Nephew, becomes a white witch of Narnia. And she has been so evil, her whole kingdom is mounted up in civil war against her. She's learned by magical arts how to say the deplorable word, which destroys everybody else but saves herself. And at that moment, she becomes anti-Aslan, who gives of himself to save others. So we've got a guy who, in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, decides he wants self-justification, Edmund. And he betrays his siblings for Turkish delight. I would have at least held out for chocolate.
It's not that great.
It's not that great. But anyway, he does this, and the only way he could be rescued is if Aslan gives his life for him. But that's not the end of the story. Edmund goes back to Narnia in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when Eustace Clarence Scrubb, who's got the heart of a dragon under the skin of a boy, turns into a dragon. And Aslan has to rescue him. Finally, when he's rescued, he comes back humbled, tender, to the party of the Dawn Treader. Only one person's awake to receive him and be father confessor to him. Who was it? Edmund, the one who then had grown through his own suffering. And then Eustace is sent back to Narnia to be the one to rescue Aurelian. There's something of entering into the process of the God who restores and the God who gives. And I don't understand it.
Yeah.
He's omnipotent. He's all powerful, but he's willing to stoop to conquer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing to me. And I don't know if we can get our minds around it, but I think we could be attracted to the wonder of it.
Yeah.
And there again, if our religion's objective, we must not avert our eyes from those elements in it. Which
Yeah, we can't turn away from it. And that's the thing when that struck me when you said he came back humbled. I think that's one of the key things is that I think as humans sometimes we slip into thinking we deserve all good and we don't deserve the pain.
And that's a false notion.
Right? And that's what leads to that question. Why am I hurting? And David sometimes says, why do I even expect good to happen? Why do we expect that we deserve everything to be good and nothing to be painful? And that's not coming from a humble perspective.
I think you can expect good, just like you can expect to make sense out of a thing.
Yeah.
We're made for sense making. We're made for ultimate good. But in the process, we can be dismissive of the process by saying, how come good isn't happening now?
Yeah.
And again, we step into the present tense of the verb rather than the future.
And on behalf of somebody else, I think a lot of when I think of suffering, the number of things that have happened to me in my life that are big, capital P pain aren't that many, but there's a lot of just smaller, bad, painful things that happen, and a lot of vicarious suffering. I think watching people who you feel, didn't deserve it, like children and, people who suffer for a long time. I think that is sometimes the harder thing to accept than even being able to live in the present tense for yourself and accepting your own suffering.
I think too, that's a really good job. I think also in the midst of that, there's this perspective that we have to gain. You see people suffer, and that should be then a prompt to alleviate suffering wherever you can. You can't alleviate everybody's suffering.
Yeah.
You can pray for them. You can.
It's another kind of suffering when you're trying to do that for everybody.
I know, but you get a realistic perspective on it, and and you do what you can, and in that your heart enlarges, I think. But we could see the problems. You watch the news at night and you see world problems, and you say, "Wow, I can't do anything about it." So we can get into the habit of just, "Wow, I can't do anything about it," and we don't do anything at all.
Shut it off. Yeah.
And so there's that as well. Do what you can. Be at peace with what God's doing in you and through you and in those circumstances as best you might. And there's a trust factor there.
Yeah.
We have to have faith that this God who's really big is under control. He knows what's going on.
Yeah.
And we have to trust him at some level.
I know. And that's a lifelong thing that we work on, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'd rather trust him, though, than trust myself.
So thinking about Lewis, thinking about pain, suffering, leaning in versus turning away, the hope that we have in Christ and the example that we have from God in Christ of kind of humility, entering in with others, sacrificial love. How has that affected you and Claudia's parenting and grandparenting? Because we're chasing you on that, trying to figure out how to help our kids when they struggle, or the feeling the vulnerability, like seeing my grandchild born and the vulnerability that becomes very, very real. Changes me.
I don't think there's a parent who could say, "I did it all perfectly."
Yeah.
We made a lot of mistakes. We tried to learn from most of them and so on. But then you have other components. It's not only the mistakes you made and what you're trying to do. And also, you don't want to say everything you did was a mistake. I think we did some good things too.
Yeah.
But then you have the kids' response to what was done. You can ask forgiveness of them, but how are they going to respond to what happened? They've got their own stories.
Yeah.
And now you've got this fabric of threads that are woven together, and we can say what we did one way or another, but that may not have been good enough. That may have been good enough, but it wasn't responded to well, or it may not have been good enough and it was responded well, or it wasn't responded well. So the simple answer, I don't think, is accessible. When we get to heaven, we'll get it sorted out.
Well, but I think the process piece you've touched on it. And I mean, there's the whole, we're seeing the back of the tapestry and the beauty is on the other side. We see all the strings woven together and knots tied, and it's pretty messy and ugly. We turn over the tapestry on the other side of this life, and we get to see the beauty that's been made in weaving all of our lives
Right.
together, which is the hope that I have. And just realizing my frailties as a dad and as a grandfather, of it connects me to God's heart a little bit more, because
Yeah.
like when my kids don't turn, or they're struggling in certain areas, and I want to be helpful and they're not really interested in my help. I know that probably doesn't happen for you,
Well,
either of you, but it happens for me. And I reach to my relationship with God, as you talked about before, of like, oh, that's his experience of me not turning towards him. And I'm awakened to the pain, awakens me to kind of the love of God.
it switches the whole dialogue, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we began by talking about the suffering people endure. Now we have to also look at the suffering we've caused.
Yeah.
And that's a little more painful to look at. And not even realizing too that we may have caused some suffering, and the response to the suffering we cause may cause people to respond badly if they don't forgive,
Yeah.
and they become bitter, and the pain they may be creating. And so there's a
Right.
domino effect in
Right.
all of this.
Yeah.
It's a fallen world. We need Jesus, basically.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
necessary. His death was necessary for us. But the idea, I talked to a person once and shared the gospel, and she said, "Well, that's I shared that's why I shared the gospel, and 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 I said I believe." She wanted to know why I was a Christian. I said I believe in the high ideal of love, but I realize I have been unlovely at times. I and have had sharp words with people I say I love most in the world. I believe in justice, but there have been times I've been unfair in my treatment of others. Didn't set out to be, but in retrospect, I realized I had. And I said, I don't think I could make it in life if I didn't know that God forgave me and loved me unconditionally. She said, well, I can appreciate that, but that's just not my issue. And I said, I think I know what you're saying. I didn't become a Christian until I was in my first year of college. And I didn't become perfect overnight. That took 2 or 3 weeks. It was at a high table at Oxford University where this conversation was going on. The whole faculty busted up in laughter. And I said, your laughter just betrayed you.
Yeah.
She said, what do you mean? I said, well, you and I just met, so you couldn't know the specifics of my life that made that last statement nonsense, but you laughed at the nonsensical nature of it. Either your read of history or your read of your own heart shows you nobody has it together. She said, you got me. I said, I wasn't out to get anybody, but let me ask you a serious question. Given what you know about your own life, what gets you by? She says, I have faith in humanity. So I said, well, let me ask you about your faith in humanity. Have you ever been wounded by another human being before? She said, of course. I said, have you ever wounded another human being before? She said, well, I suppose so. I said, how does this faith in humanity work where we've both been wounded and we've done our fair share of wounding? The man who taught French next to her at that dinner table said, how does it work for Christians? And we talked about grace. And I spent the rest of the meal talking about the love of God, the forgiveness of God, the grace of God. It may be opaque to us at times because the pain is so great. He's shouting to us in our pain.
Yeah.
But then in time, the shouting dies down and we can begin to hear the still small voice coming through once again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the only hopeful way, is looking at we'll never be perfect. We will never be perfect. Humanity will never be perfect. But
This life.
in this life.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm talking about this earthly, painful life.
Right.
But there's a bigger story for us, always like backing up, zooming out and looking at there's a bigger story going on.
Yeah.
That we can't possibly understand, but we're called to be a part of.
Yeah.
We're already a part of it, whether we participate or not.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
joining in that story and knowing there's more going on helps to kind of make sense of, we might not ever understand why we're hurting
And
or
then,
why other people are.
and then getting back to David's question, how does that work for parenting? You realize we're making mistakes. We're learning and growing from our mistakes. We're asking forgiveness for our mistakes, but our story is also part of somebody else's story who has their own pilgrimage to
That's
go
right.
through.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the story is powerful. We think about perspective, we think about development, right? There's tasks that we have now that are unique to different, like your marriage 50 years now you have different tasks than you did when you were newly married.
Mhm.
And so the developmental timeline changes. How we talk about it matters. Like, you're a gifted storyteller. You love Lewis in his storytelling. The way we tell the story matters.
Yeah.
The virtues and the morals, as well as the struggles, matter in terms of it might not be until page 60,
Yeah.
and we're on page 1.
But the telling of the story does matter. Um, there's a dialogue by Plato called the Gorgias. In the Gorgias, they talk about rhetoric. They start off by talking about rhetoric. And pretty soon they have to discuss justice, because the rhetorician may be a good storyteller, but they also might, by virtue of their ability to tell a good story, be manipulative. So how do you work towards justice? And it gets down to this whole thing that God, I think, is trying to squeeze some nectar out of our experiences, and the nectar is virtue. But virtue is always seen as a habitual part of life. One virtuous act doesn't make you a virtuous person. So there's got to be cultivation of habit in the midst of all of these things.
Yeah.
That's why maybe the suffering is ongoing.
Yeah.
Different kinds of suffering.
Yeah.
Again. And we gain some breadth to the virtue. But virtue is always seen as an integrated whole made up of courage. You can't gain courage without endurance, without fortitude, without going through these things. Courage, temperance. Temperance is the ability to resist the enticement of the immediate pleasure in order to gain the greater, the more remote good. So it might be a means whereby I am saying no to this thing, difficult as it may be, because I want that. I say no to it because I've got a bigger picture here. So temperance, justice. Justice is a one feature of moral development that says my moral development is linked to my responsibility to others. Cain's the first guy who violates it, right? He says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" It's interesting to me that God comes to him before he sins,
Yeah.
and God comes to him immediately after he sins. God's always a pursuer. He's always the one wanting to woo us back and bring us into places of restoration. But justice, it's concern for the general welfare of one society. And my moral development is lacking if I'm not engaged in that at some level. And then there's wisdom. The wisdom becomes the fruit of this process of gaining virtue. So
Yeah.
anyway.
I love that, because that feels like that's something we can grasp, something about trying to build those habits that lead us to be able to live in the discovery
Yeah.
and to grow in our response to it.
Yeah.
And that's always what I hope for as I get older, that I won't be the one digging the hole into my own pain, but I'll be the rose, as I mature in life. So that's it. It feels hopeful, Jerry.
There will often be hole digging and rose blooming. And my guess is our goal is to try and develop a garden of experiences rather than.
See,
That's a good
and I'm
point.
sitting here thinking, and my job as a therapist is deal with all the manure that helps the
Yeah, you help the
flowers
garden
grow.
I
grow.
like
Yeah.
manure. I'm a root.
Well, I will feed you a bunch of crap to help you, and between us, the rose will bloom.
Grow together. That's a perfect way to wrap that up.
Oh, I wanted to ask one more question.
Yeah.
Like, what, as we wrap up, what haven't we asked that we should have of you
Um,
in our wandering conversation?
well, we've got the idea that understanding involves getting my mind around something and getting my heart around something in a way that's sufficient enough that I can make good choices in the midst of it. And there are some rational things we could say about the problem of evil. That you can't utterly separate it from your humanity and from the struggles and so on. But there are some things. And Thomas Aquinas said, and actually in Christian circles, there's two major approaches to this problem.
Yeah.
One is a free will theodicy. Theodicy comes from two Greek words, theos and dike, the justification of God given the fact that there's evil in the world. And so a free will theodicy is that evil is a consequence of the ill use of free will, human or supernatural, i.e. diabolical abuses. And then the other one is a soul-making theodicy that comes out of the thought of Irenaeus, Saint Irenaeus, or Boethius has some stuff about this too, that the bad I endure is a place where God is creating character in my life. So it's sometimes good to get our minds around those two approaches to the problem of evil, the free will feature, my responsibility in the midst of it, and the soul making, what God's trying to do in me in the midst of it. And I think those are things we could have talked about. We didn't talk about that, but that's okay. Your listeners need to go do some digging.
That's right. We're going to have a reading list in the show notes of all the books you've mentioned of that people can have a graduate study in not only pain, but in who Jesus is and the goodness that he provides and the hope as we navigate life's pain, whether it's things that happen to us or things that we do to others.
An honest approach to any real question should drive us into a more robust and enriched understanding of what God's intentions are for us and what he's done for us in Christ and what he's given us in his word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, we will have a list if you have any reading recommendations for people in our podcast notes. So we'll add that later.
Okay.
Yeah. But thank you so much for coming, Jerry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a good
delightful
time.
people. And I love to hear you sing in church.
I love it.